The ground shook, mountains split open, and the sky itself turned black with fire. This was the world our earliest ancestors faced. Volcanoes weren't just natural disasters. They were terrifying gates of destruction and rebirth. For those who lived in their shadow, survival meant choices that would alter the destiny of humankind. Whole landscapes vanished beneath ash, rivers boiled, and fertile lands were both created and destroyed. Yet out of this chaos came the first great journeys of migration. Forced to move, to adapt, and to seek safer horizons, humanity spread across the globe, guided by fire itself. The story of humanity's earliest journeys is not simply about walking from one place to another. It is about survival against the most terrifying forces of nature, and few forces were as powerful, unpredictable, and transformative as volcanoes. When we imagine our ancestors, we often see them as hunters and gatherers roaming plains or seeking shelter in caves. But before they could ever dream of building villages or crossing continents, they had to endure a world where the earth itself would suddenly explode beneath their feet. A volcano was not merely a mountain. It was a living monster, rumbling deep within the earth, spewing fire and smoke, blackening the skies, and erasing entire landscapes in hours. These eruptions did not just destroy, they reshaped the paths humans would take, scattering groups of early humans across regions and pushing them into lands they might never have entered otherwise. For instance, nearly 74,000 years ago, the eruption of Mount Toba in present-day Indonesia is believed to have been one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Scientists estimate it hurled so much ash into the sky that sunlight dimmed. For years, triggering what some call a volcanic winter. Crops withered, animals died in massive numbers, and human populations were forced to abandon familiar territories in search of food and safety. For early humans who were still fragile communities trying to find their place in the world, this was both a curse and an opportunity. Entire groups were fractured and displaced, but these desperate movements sparked migrations into new lands, where they would adapt, learn, and evolve. Imagine small bands of humans, perhaps no more than a few dozen individuals, walking away from ash-choked valleys into unknown landscapes, carrying with them fire, tools, and stories of the mountain that destroyed their home. Each step they took into new territories was not only an act of survival, but also the beginning of humanity spread across the globe. Volcanoes, in this sense, were both destroyers and creators. While they obliterated forests and villages, they also left behind fertile soils rich with minerals, making new lands ideal for farming thousands of years later. Early humans might not have understood the science behind eruptions, but they recognized the danger and the promise. They came to see volcanoes as sacred and feared, weaving them into myths and rituals that explained their raw power. In Africa, where humanity began, volcanic landscapes shaped migration routes along the Great Rift Valley, guiding people with their mountains, lakes, and fertile soils. In Europe and Asia, eruptions forced small communities to leave their homelands and travel along rivers, coasts, and plains, unknowingly charting the future paths of civilizations. In the Pacific, island peoples learned to live with volcanic fire, even using eruptions as signals to move from one island to another in search of safety. It is no exaggeration to say that without volcanoes, the history of human migration might have been slower, smaller, and less daring. These fiery events tested humanity's resilience, and through the fire and ash, our ancestors became explorers, seekers, and survivors. The ground beneath them may have cracked, and the skies may have darkened, but each eruption lit a torch that carried humans further into the unknown. The great journeys of humankind out of Africa, across Asia, into Europe, and eventually to the farthest corners of the earth were not just driven by curiosity or hunger, but by the fury of the planet itself. Volcanoes forced people to abandon comfort, to risk the unfamiliar, and in doing so, they shaped the destiny of humanity's first migrations. To understand how deeply volcanoes influenced the first human migrations, we must step into the shoes of those early ancestors as they lived in a fragile balance between life and death. For while they were intelligent and adaptable, they were also incredibly vulnerable, living without permanent homes, relying on seasonal food, and carrying only the tools they could make from stone, wood, and bone. So when a volcano erupted, it was not simply a terrifying event, it was a force that could wipe out entire food sources, poison rivers, or blanket whole valleys in ash, leaving nothing to return to. And this relentless reality pushed humans again and again to seek refuge in safer lands, often far beyond what they would normally dare to travel. Meaning every eruption acted like a natural trigger for migration, propelling families into unknown territories, forcing them to discover new resources, and in doing so broadening the reach of humanity across continents. Consider the eruption of Mount Toba again, for it is believed to have reduced human populations so drastically that only small, scattered groups remained, and these survivors, faced with freezing climates and barren lands, had no choice but to move to chase warmth and food, to seek regions where the sun still shone through thinner clouds of ash. And so from Southeast Asia to the Indian subcontinent, from Africa into Arabia, people began journeys that would set the stage for global expansion. Volcanoes also left permanent marks on the psyche of our species, for those who survived them carried the memory of fire and destruction. And this memory was passed down through oral traditions, shaping myths of angry gods, sacred mountains, and the need to respect forces greater than themselves. And as humans migrated, these myths traveled too, embedding the presence of volcanoes into cultural identities across the globe. In East Africa, volcanic highlands created fertile regions that attracted groups again and again, not because they were safe, but because they were rich with resources. So even when eruptions drove people away, generations later they returned, continuing a cycle of displacement and resettlement that trained humans to live with constant uncertainty. In Central Asia, where volcanic activity combined with shifting climates, communities migrated along river valleys, spreading technologies and ideas wherever they went, meaning volcanoes were not just destroyers, they were catalysts of cultural exchange. Think of the small bands who fled a volcanic disaster only to encounter other groups in new lands. These chance meetings led to sharing of survival strategies, the blending of languages, and even the mixing of genes, shaping the diversity of humanity today. Volcanic landscapes also became natural highways, for the cool lava flows created open corridors through dense forests or barren lands, guiding migrations in ways we can still trace through archaeological evidence. And the obsidian born of ancient eruptions became one of the most prized materials for tools and weapons. So wherever people migrated, obsidian connected them to volcanoes long after the ash had settled. Imagine a family carrying shards of obsidian as they moved away from a deadly eruption, tools that gave them the edge to hunt better, defend themselves, and survive in foreign territories. This silent connection to a volcano meant its influence stretched far beyond the blast zone. As humanity spread further, volcanic events continued to shape their paths. In the Mediterranean, eruptions from mountains like Santorini changed trade routes and settlement patterns thousands of years later, but their echoes go back to those first daring migrations when survival meant moving forward or perishing under ash. In the Pacific Ring of Fire, where volcanic activity was constant, whole island populations learned to navigate seas because the land itself could betray them at any time, and their journeys across vast oceans became some of the greatest feats of human exploration. Each of these movements, whether across a river valley or an entire ocean, can trace its spark back to fire beneath the earth, to the volcanic forces that refused to let humanity remain still. Volcanoes trained us to be restless, to anticipate change, to never depend on one place too long, and this restless spirit became the heart of migration, the driving force that would eventually carry humans into every corner of the globe. In truth, if not for volcanoes, perhaps humanity would have lingered longer in familiar lands, afraid to risk the unknown, but the eruptions gave no choice. They were the ruthless teachers of adaptation, and their lessons were written into the footsteps of every migrant who dared to move forward into mystery. As humanity continued its long and arduous journey across continents, volcanoes remained ever-present shadows on the horizon, reminding our ancestors that the earth itself was alive, unpredictable and merciless, and though the danger never ceased, It was this very unpredictability that forged resilience into the human spirit. For every eruption became a trial of endurance, and every migration a story of courage written in ash and fire. And when we follow the path of these movements, we see that volcanic events not only displaced people but also created opportunities. For new lands forged by eruptions often became havens of survival, rich with soil that would one day give rise to agriculture. So the same forces that once threatened extinction later enabled the flourishing of civilizations. Picture small groups who once fled the choking clouds of Toba finding fertile valleys in distant lands, or early humans escaping an African eruption only to stumble into river systems that provided endless resources. These accidents of survival were no accidents at all, but the direct result of the fiery earth pushing humanity forward, reshaping its destiny again and again. Migration was never a straight path. It was a mosaic of movements, pauses, and returns. And volcanoes played the role of both destroyer and guide, teaching humans that permanence was an illusion, that survival meant embracing change, and that the world itself would never stop shifting beneath their feet. Over time, these early lessons became ingrained into human culture, transforming fear into reverence. Volcanoes became sacred symbols, worshipped and feared across every land. Their eruptions remembered not just as disasters, but as cosmic signs. And in this reverence, we see the echoes of those first migrations, when survival depended on respecting the fiery power that shaped the land. Even today, archaeological sites around volcanic regions reveal traces of these journeys: obsidian tools carried far from their source, camps abandoned under layers of ash, and bones preserved in the very ground created by eruptions, all silent. Witnesses to the fact that our ancestors did not simply live near volcanoes. They lived because of them. They adapted through them. And they expanded across the globe because the earth itself demanded they move. Without these cataclysmic forces, the story of human migration might have been slower, less daring, and perhaps even confined, but with volcanoes as relentless catalysts, humanity was pushed to spread across deserts, mountains, coasts, and oceans, learning with every step how to master fire, adapt to new climates, and eventually build societies that could withstand the Earth's fury. The great irony is that the same destructive explosions that once drove terrified families into the unknown gave birth to the global species we are today, scattered yet connected by a shared origin story written in fire. And when we look back, across the millennia, we can see that volcanoes were not merely backdrops to human survival. They were active forces shaping migration, culture, and destiny. They made us travelers, explorers, and survivors, and even now, as we stand in modern cities with science at our side, we remain children of those fiery mountains, forever marked by the migrations they inspired. For the truth is simple yet profound: without volcanoes, humanity might never have left home, never have spread so far, and never have become the restless, resilient, and global people we are today.